let's take a closer look at the structures of the brain. I'm going to do a brief overview and then we're going to look in more detail at the different parts and what they do. When we look at the brain, the main part of the brain that we see is the cerebellum. This is the thinking part of the brain and what we usually think of when we talk about brain. Underneath and toward the posterior of the cerebellum, we find the cerebellum, sometimes called the little brain. In front of the cerebellum, we have the brain stem, which involves control of a lot of our involuntary functions. And then sort of up in the middle, we have what's called the diencephalon, which also is important for regulating a lot of our involuntary functions. Let's start with the brain stem and work our way up. The brain stem has three main parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla oblongata is what connects the brain to the spinal cord and therefore to the rest of the body. This contains neurons that are going to be carrying information from the brain down to the rest of the body through the spinal cord, or from the body up into the brain. The medulla oblongata also contains several nuclei, and here we have a term that we've used before that we're going to be using differently. In the past, when we talked about a nucleus, we were talking about the protons and neutrons in the center of a single atom. When we're talking about the level of the brain, a nucleus is a group of cell bodies. And we have several of these important groups of cell bodies in the brainstem, especially in the medulla oblongata. Some of the important nuclei in the medulla oblongata include the cardiac center. This is what's going to send signals to the heart in order to control the force and the rate of the heartbeat. We also have respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata that control the rate and depth of breathing. We have a vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata that's important for regulating blood pressure, either by narrowing the blood vessels to raise the pressure or by dilating blood vessels to reduce blood pressure. And there are also centers in there that control coughing, sneezing, vomiting, and other sorts of involuntary reactions. Moving up from the medulla oblongata, we see this rounded area called the pons. The pons is the bridge between the medulla oblongata and the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So a lot of information crosses there in the pons. The pons also has a couple of nuclei that are important for regulating breathing, especially gathering information from the cerebrum and cerebellum and integrating that information to adjust the respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata. The most superior part of the brainstem is the midbrain. The midbrain plays an important role in integrating the reflexes involving the eyes and the ears. This includes things like regulating the constriction and dilation of the pupils, the startle response in response to a loud noise, turning your head in order to track sounds, or moving your eyes in order to track objects in your field of vision, and the focusing of our vision by changing the shape of the lens. All of these are regulated through the midbrain. The brainstem also contains many of the neurons that are part of a network called the reticular formation. The reticular formation is a network of neurons extending from the brainstem down the spinal cord and up into the more conscious cerebrum of the brain that are important for regulating things like consciousness, sleep, and general states of alertness and arousal, as well as muscle tone and balance. Moving from the brainstem to the cerebellum, we see that the cerebellum works to help coordinate things, to help coordinate movements especially. Your cerebellum receives a lot of information about the position of your body. It gets information from your eyes, from your ears, especially those parts of the ear that are involved in balance and orientation, as well as information from the muscles and joints about the position of your body. And it looks at all of that information to build a picture of exactly how your body is standing or moving in space. Then it also looks at the signals coming from the cerebrum about how the body intends to move. So signals from the cerebrum controlling your voluntary movements also send information to the cerebellum, so it knows what your intended movements are. And by comparing what your body is actually doing with all of this input from the eyes, the ears, and the proprioceptors, the position sensors in your muscles and joints, to what you actually want to be doing, The cerebellum can make some adjustments in balance, in position, in the strength, force, or timing of the movements in order to have your body do what you want it to do. You don't actually need a cerebellum to be able to move, but it is important to help maintain the coordination and timing of movements that you need for balance and to move the way you want to. If we move a little deeper toward the center of the brain, we get to the structure called the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. If we slice the brain exactly in half down the midline, we only see a small section of the thalamus, just this little bit where the two halves of the thalamus come together is all that we can see. The rest of the thalamus is sort of buried up in the brain, a little bit to the right and the left. So this side of the figure shows you what the thalamus looks like entirely. The thalamus serves as an important relay station. Almost all of the sensory information from your body gets relayed through the thalamus, and the thalamus sort of does a first look at the sensory information coming in and decides what to do with it. The thalamus will relay some of the information up to the cerebrum where we'll have a conscious recognition of that sensation, and some of it we'll never even notice or feel because the thalamus filters it out. The thalamus does allow us some crude interpretation of things like pain, temperature, or pressure, but it's not very specific. If we want to be specific about what we're feeling or what we're detecting with our senses, that has to go up to the cerebrum. But the thalamus can at least give us an idea of what we're feeling. In addition to its importance as a sensory relay station, the thalamus also plays a role with the limbic system, which I'll talk about later, in learning and memory. The hypothalamus is what connects to the pituitary gland. And we talked about the hypothalamus when we were talking about the endocrine system, because we saw a lot of really important signals coming from the hypothalamus going to the pituitary gland to control the release of pituitary gland hormones. In order for that function to work, the hypothalamus has to be able to sort of measure the levels of hormones in the body so it knows when more need to be released and when they don't. We saw that with the negative feedback of the hormones coming back and stopping the release of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. In order to detect the conditions of the blood, like the amount of hormone in the blood, the hypothalamus capillaries are not part of the blood-brain barrier. That allows the hypothalamus access to the blood to be able to measure a number of different substances, not only the amounts of hormones, but also levels of nutrients like glucose and amino acids, temperature, and other components of the blood. The hypothalamus uses this information that it can gather about the composition of the blood to regulate a lot of important involuntary body systems that are necessary to maintain homeostasis. The hypothalamus contains a thirst center, which detects the concentration of the blood, and when the blood gets too concentrated, it stimulates the sensation of thirst so that we'll drink, as well as causing the release of antidiuretic hormone, which is going to cause the kidneys to retain more water to prevent dehydration. The hypothalamus also contains the hunger center that looks at the levels of amino acids and glucose in the blood to determine whether we need to consume more food to maintain healthy levels of those molecules. When the level of glucose or amino acids gets too low, then the hypothalamus stimulates sensations of hunger and food-seeking behaviors that make us go eat something. To balance that out, the hypothalamus has a satiety center. This is what's going to stop hunger when we have consumed food. What happens is that we eat food which stretches the stomach, which is detected by the satiety center, which then inhibits the hunger center so that we stop eating. The hypothalamus also contains our thermostat that measures the temperature of our blood and makes adjustments to either increase or decrease body temperature if we've gotten too cold or too warm. And finally, the hypothalamus is involved in the regulation of a lot of the autonomic nervous system. So remember, the autonomic nervous system is what controls a lot of our visceral motor functions, the movements of smooth muscle and the secretions of glands, things that we don't have conscious thoughts about. The hypothalamus sends axons that affect a lot of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons that can then affect things like heart rate, blood pressure, digestive and urinary function, and things like that.